Hello and welcome to the Hobby Hour. I'm Chase Untermeyer, a professor of practice here at the University of Houston at the Hobby School. And today we are most honored and privileged to have one of the great living Texans. And in fact, I would say one of the great Texans, past and present, and that is former Senator, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Bailey Hutchison. Welcome, Senator Hutchison, to the Hobby Hour.
Thank you, Chase. I am so happy to be with you. I'm so happy that you are doing this at the University of Houston. I think professor of practice is certainly an interesting sort of area because you're basically saying this is how it goes in the real world, and that's where I've been, as opposed to having been, really just talking about what you do. You've actually done it. I think that's a great thing that U of H is doing, and I'm sure that the Hobby School values that practice because, of course, Bill Hobby was such an icon in Texas politics, and he was in the arena, as was his wonderful mother. So they are the people who really broke a lot of barriers, and their family has given so much to Texas. So it's a perfect course, professor of practice, and I applaud that they are doing it and that you're the professor because you've been there too.
Well, nobody has been more in the practice than yourself at all different levels of government, and we want to get on to that. But let me say that we are looking forward to hosting you here on the campus on Wednesday, the 13th of September at 6 o'clock in the evening. You will be the prime guest at the annual Elizabeth Rockwell lecture. And it will actually be a conversation that you and I have on stage with opportunity for the audience to ask questions afterwards. So everybody's looking forward to that. But today we hope to get a little bit of the background of your life leading into a career of public service. Maybe to start off, at what point in your life did the thought of being in the public eye, especially as a public official, come to pass?
Yes, well, Chase, I guess this is the when a door closes, open a window story, because I hadn't really thought about politics. I did go to law school, and I loved law school. It was the first time I ever really enjoyed studying, but I was not prepared for post-law school and not being able to get a job. But back when I was in law school, there may have been 10 or 12 women in my class, but law firms didn't hire women. And whereas now women are more than half of the entering class of the University of Texas Law School, where I went, the recruiters didn't even interview women. And so I hit my first brick wall of life, actually, when I started looking for a job in Houston. I moved back to Houston because I had grown up in Galveston County, Lamarck, Texas. Moved back to Houston, started looking for a job, and, came to the realization after 4 months of getting interviews at law firms, but never getting an offer. So none of them had women in their partnership track either. So it was just a new thing for them. And so I was pretty discouraged, and I was on my way home from another interview, and I was passing KPRC TV. And I thought, you know what, maybe I ought to be looking at something different. So I pulled in the parking lot, walked in, and said to the receptionist, I'd like to talk to someone about a job. And she said, well, what kind of job? And I said, well, news reporter. And she said, oh, so you want to talk to the news director? And I said, yeah, news director. Okay, so I had not taken any journalism in college at all, so I didn't know what a news director was, but I found out pretty quick. because Ray Miller, who was the news director at the time, came out to see me, which I found out later was very unusual for an applicant. But he came out and he said, you know, I've never had a lawyer apply for a job before. We don't really have an opening, but don't take another job until I talk to you again. And I said, okay, that was easy. So I said, sure. So actually I went on continuing to interview, and about 2 weeks later, I guess, I did actually got a job offer from the wonderful general counsel of the city of Houston. And he offered me a job in the city of Houston. And I liked him very much. And I thought, oh, well, this is real. It's a possibility. And so I called Ray Miller, as you know, I said I would. And he said, oh, I'm so glad you called, because I want to offer you a job. And I said, oh my gosh, really? And so he said yes. And he said, I want you, because you're a lawyer, to cover the legislature and the courts. And I said, great. And I remember so well, because I called my father, and who had put me through undergraduate and law school. And I said, Dad, I have a job. And he said, wonderful. And I said, I'm going to work for KPRC. And he said, what? And I said, I'm going to work for KPRC. I'm really excited about it. I know it's different. And he said, yeah, it's different. And he said, so is it radio or TV or what? And I said, oh, I don't know. I don't know which one. So anyway, that's a long story long, but I did go to work for KPRC, and I found out later, and this is where I'd like to say something about Avita Kalpati. Ray had gone back to her because the Houston Post owned KPRC. He'd gone back and he said, you know, we don't have in the budget another news reporter, but we have a woman who is a law school graduate, and we want to hire her. And I'm told that Ovita said, I should be the first television station in Houston to hire a woman reporter. And I didn't find that out until later, but I did go to work there, of course, for the TV station and the radio station, and I got to do both. And Ray Miller was a wonderful person. And of course, I revere Avita Kalpati because she took that chance. And then, you know, it was almost immediate after she hired me at KPRC that the other two stations also hired women. All of a sudden, there was a woman who was very successful at the other station. I think Jessica Savage came in after that. I think she was ABC. And then the CBS station got one too. So, you know, it was a beginning, and it was a great beginning, but that's where, again, a long story long, I ended up covering the political scene and getting to know the people while I was interviewing and covering the legislature. And the station put me in Austin full time. So I worked there full time during the legislative sessions, and it turned out to be just a wonderful gift, which then led to my being actually asked to run for the legislature by the Republican county chairman, Nancy Palm, who you know well. She was quite a personality. And she asked me to run for the legislature because they had single member districts for the first time in 1972, after the census in 1970. And the legislature decided that Houston should have, that all the counties should have single member districts. And Houston and Dallas had not had that before. They ran countywide. And so Harris County was all Democrats. And then eventually Republicans started winning, I think, right at the end of the 60s. They started winning in some of these districts, but then after single member districts, she knew that there would be a whole area where there would be some Republican opportunities. And so I was recruited and loved being able to do that and to be elected to the legislature from Houston.
We'll talk in a moment about that experience, but reflect, if you will, to what degree having been a reporter, especially on television, helped you to serve in the legislature and later in other offices?
Oh, it was huge. And I think you know something about that too, because you were in journalism before you took that same step and ran.
I was a humble newspaper reporter, not a glamorous TV reporter, however. But.
Well, the print reporters did not think that TV reporters were very important or substantive. They sort of looked down on me, but it was really, it was funny the way they did. But nevertheless, we humble television reporters who were not accepted very well by our print counterparts. Actually, it started a great learning experience because it helped me immensely after I was able to be elected to know the ropes. I knew the people, but I also knew the processes. And I was very much ahead of other freshmen because I did know the processes. And of course, I had a wonderful friend and colleague who was elected lieutenant governor, Bill Hobby, and we developed a great relationship on the Senate side as well, because back then we were also collegial. Of course, he was elected as a Democrat, but because of my experience at KPRC, we had a lot in common, and with his mother, of course. And so it was a very fun time, and I learned so much from the news reporting to see not only what the processes were, but who was effective and how they became effective. Some were great orators, some had great personalities, some were just kind of in the weeds and studying and knowing exactly what the processes were and what's so important that a lot of freshmen miss is knowing the rules of the House or the rules of the Senate. Helps so much. And that became even more important when I was in the United States Senate, because there the rules of the Senate were even more important and more complicated, because you could sometimes get things done by knowing the rules. And that was a huge advantage, which a lot of newcomers would not realize.
Today, when Republican Party dominates Texas, it's easy to forget, and some people may not even know that the era that you entered politics was totally dominated by Democrats. Was that an issue, a problem for you being in the very tiny minority?
It was really tiny. There were 13 Republicans in the House out of 150. So that's how tiny we were. And it was interesting, though, because we were so small, no one feared us, but we got along with both the Democratic factions. And there was a very clear conservative Democratic faction and a very clear liberal Democratic faction. And the Republicans, our tiny little band, would ally with the conservative Democrats on fiscal responsibility and fiscal issues. And we allied with the liberal Democrats on election reforms, redistricting, the things where the minority would want to make sure that we had the capability to do what we wanted to do. And so it was very much fun. And in those days, we were all so collegial. We we did things together socially, Democrats and Republicans, and there were so many events that legislators do, so many places that they go, that it was a fun experience, a very different and fun experience, which is really among the most fun times I've ever had in my life. When I got to the U.S. Senate, it was, you had collegiality, I will say that, and you worked across the aisle, and you had friends across the aisle, but it was so much more serious and so much more comprehensive in representing a big state like Texas, where there were so many areas that you had to know and protect and represent. But the legislature was just, it was much more fun, and of course, much more state oriented. So really your goals were generally the same. Republicans and Democrats, you worked education, you worked budget, you worked appropriations, but it was all for the good of the state. So I would say it was among my most fun times.
I know we'll get into the Senate part soon enough here, but how did the Republican Party grow from having a tiny band to being the majority? And I'm thinking in particular your victory to be elected state treasurer, which is one of the very first statewide positions to be held by Republicans. So what changed over those years?
Well, in the first instance, I would say that the Democrats got out of touch with the people. And so Democrats began to switch parties and become Republicans if they just were not comfortable anymore with some of the more liberal projects and bills that were going through in the legislative process. But the way the Republicans started gaining not only seats in the legislature, but also, as you said, I worked up to be elected state treasurer. I think that we started at the grassroots, and we began to do all of our campaigning grassroots. When I ran for the legislature, I knocked on every door of every person who was registered to vote. And, you know, you could get the voting records for a small district, as you know, because you did it. And I went door to door. And to this day, people still stop me in the airport and say, you came to my door, you know, in 1972, because it was a great grassroots campaigning. But we also did the same thing at the county level. For instance, we would, there would be an all Democratic county commissioner's court, and we would go for electing one county commissioner, and the whole party would go for electing one county commissioner that was Republican. And then it became two, and then maybe it was the county judge. So we just were doing grassrootsy things. We were like, I was a precinct chairman also when I first moved to Dallas, especially, and after I got married, moved to Dallas, I was a precinct chairman. I went door to door to register voters, and I was grassroots. I then served on the State Republican Executive Committee, which is I think elected by a senatorial district. So I was very much in the grassroots. So all of my campaigning, including state treasurer, was grassroots, and it was, you know, going to a state convention where the other leaders were, you got to know them. And, you know, for a student that is not yet involved in politics, you know, I would still recommend getting involved in your party, whichever your party is, and see where you're most comfortable with your core beliefs, and and start getting to know the party activists and who's helping other candidates, and begin to work maybe in a campaign, for state legislature or school board or city council, whatever it is that is of interest. I would recommend getting involved with the grassroots people, because they're the ones who generally are nice. They're people that you want to associate with. You want to be in the Democratic Club or the Republican Club. You want to be able to meet others who are sort of like-minded about what you want out of government, whether it's school board or city council or the state or federal. And so you begin to form relationships. And then when you decide you are ready to run for public office, which I would say, I would recommend that you wait until you've had some more experience in a career, because you'll be a better legislator or better city council person if you've had more experience in your career to know what really works and what doesn't, and also what your core beliefs are. But it's really grassroots, I think, that still matters, even though we're in a social media world. I still think the grassroots is going to matter, and it's what's going to help our country get back on track.
Well, I absolutely endorse and applaud what you said. And just to underline it, I would say that the advantage for any students, anybody watching who aspires to get into government and politics, of the advantage of working for a candidate for the legislature, school board, city council, is not only do you see how things work at the grassroots, but you really get to know the candidate. And while a candidate for the U.S. Senate or president, governor might be a very high level, you'll be lucky to go to a rally and see the person a quarter mile away. Whereas if you work in a local campaign, you get to know the person very, very well.
I agree totally. And you also learn what's important to people at that level. You'll hear what the constituents are asking and what the people who are trying to decide who they're going to vote for care about. And I think that's where Republicans started gaining strength, is we were talking to people in the grocery store and at the school board meetings or the PTA meetings. And I think that's so important, that whatever tribe you want to be in, that you do know what's on people's minds, and you're talking to people about their priorities, and you're learning from working in a campaign how the candidate is successful or not.
I know you're not in the business of giving advice to the Democratic Party, but is this the formula for the Democrats to come back in Texas and once again be a majority?
I think it's for both parties. I think both parties now have a real need to get back to the mainstream. And I think both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have lost the middle. And I think it's time to talk to the real people and what they care about. And so I would advise, whatever your core belief is, and as a student, you're not really likely to be so focused on the politics of the day, and it may be that you're getting involved in the politics at the U of H campus. I mean, that's part of getting to know people and getting to know what is on people's minds.
And in fact, there have been campus politicians at the University of Houston who've gone on to elected office, state legislature, county judge. So starting off in student politics is not a bad way to start.
It is. And to see also, when you're in student politics, to kind of see where the students are, but also to see where the adult leaders of the university, like your board of regents or your president Renu Khator, who's been a wonderful president there. I think trying to get the boundaries of where students are and where there's a difference in student debate, and then also what the administrators and leaders that are older are saying about that. That's all part of the learning process.
So how did you get elected to the U.S. Senate? What is that big step and the story behind it?
Well, the biggest step was state treasurer, because I ran a truly grassroots door-to-door campaign for state treasurer, because basically the big money was not going to the state treasurer's race because no one thought that I could win. And basically all the money was going to the governor candidate, lieutenant governor. That was sort of the focus. And so the down ballot races were not so much. And so I ran, I mean, we were sending postcards by volunteers to their friends to campaign and ask people to do that. And when I ran statewide, I did have a lot of friends from my college days, either sorority sisters or friends from college that I knew in the different counties. And so I would go in to a county where I wouldn't know anyone, and I wanted to go in throughout Texas. I ended up, by the way, visiting all of the counties in Texas, 254, which it took several years to do it because you had to plan for it, but I loved that experience to really see everything in Texas. But I would go into a county where I didn't know anyone, and the campaign would have a little ad that would say, I was coming to town, or maybe the local paper would run it, and someone would come in and they would have been at UT with me, and so they would say, well, can I help? And I would say, yes, you're my young county chairman. and the person would say, oh, okay, so what does that mean? And so, we would do that little grassroots thing. And so it was grassroots that elected me state treasurer. And I also was able to get endorsements from a lot of the associations that put out cards of who the association was supporting, like especially the agriculture associations. The Farm Bureau was a huge help that endorsed me for state treasurer when they were, they weren't endorsing very many Republicans, but they did endorse me, and that got me into a lot of rural areas that I wouldn't have been able to know people. And so those were the kinds of things that helped. I love the Farm Bureau to this day because they took a chance. And of course, it was so important then, after I was elected state treasurer, this was an advantage that I didn't expect. I never expected to run for the Senate. I really had hoped someday to be governor. And so as state treasurer, I never expected to run for the Senate. But what happened was when Clinton was elected president, he appointed Lloyd Bentsen to be his Treasury Secretary, which left the vacancy then in the Senate. And what happened and gave me the advantage that I wasn't expecting is that I was the highest ranking Republican elected in Texas at the time. Everybody else was Democrat above me on the ballot, but because of that, I did have a statewide base, and I had really done all the grassroots campaigning. So I'd had a great base, which I had hoped at some point to maybe be able to run for governor. But then so many people were calling me and saying, you should run for this seat in the Senate. And I thought about it, and I wasn't at all sure. but I ended up saying yes, and I had a great support base because I had a statewide base, but I was running against 2 sitting congressmen in this special election, another former congressman, the incumbent senator who had been appointed by Governor Richards, Bob Kruger. So I was running against all these people, and back then a congressman was the more likely person to be elected to the Senate. You know, generally in the U.S. Senate, most of them have served in Congress, but I found out that a statewide base really made a difference in a big state like Texas.
In fact, if you look back over Texas history, members of Congress who, as you say, are typically in other smaller states elected to the Senate have not succeeded. Having, as you did, a statewide base gave you a huge advantage over a member of the House of Representatives.
Yes, and it was just a totally unexpected one because I'd only been state treasurer then for actually Clinton was elected the next cycle. So I'd been state treasurer for 2 years and had that under my belt, and, you know, loved being state treasurer because we had done some great work. Actually, I fought a state income tax that was on the drawing boards when I was state treasurer, and I was sort of the lead against that state income tax. So I had experience there, but you're right. In our past, Lloyd Benson was a congressman, but John Tower wasn't, and neither was Ralph Yarborough. So in Texas, that statewide base was a big help. But I got the statewide base by grassroots, and then also, of course, it was so unexpected that nobody else was prepared, and the congressman that ran just really were not prepared for all of the bigness of Texas, and so it did give me an advantage in the end.
And a very big landslide, if I remember, in the final result.
Yeah, it actually, yes, it was a big landslide because even the appointed senator didn't have a statewide base. So I beat him even in the first round. And then it was a huge advantage in the end.
So you entered the U.S. Senate. How many other women were serving in the Senate when you arrived?
There were 6, and I was the 7th. So we had, by the time we wrote a book called 9 and Counting, then it was 9 of us. After I got there, I was 7, I think. And then we had 2 more, one of whom was temporary, was an appointed one that didn't end up winning. But so we ended up with 9, and we wrote a book about our lives, which we dedicated all of the proceeds to the Girl Scouts. And so we were the small minority, but now we're really over 20% and moving up. So it was another experience, but you know, in the Senate, you're a senator, and I never wanted to be a woman senator. I wanted to be Texas senator. I didn't dwell on being a woman, and I hope that women in the future don't dwell on being a woman. You're a senator for everyone. If you're elected, you're a congressman or a legislator for everyone, and you can address all the issues from your standpoint. Now, I do support women being elected because I think women should be part of the process with our experience. So I'm very supportive of our women candidates, but I also don't want to, I would never say elect me because I'm a woman. I wanted to be elected because I had the right views and I could be effective, and I hope that that's where we are going into the future.
Nevertheless, you did bring a different perspective. Did it make a difference? If not for you, then collectively the other women senators?
Oh, for sure. It does make a difference. And because we bring our experience to the table, and this was true in the legislature as well, I have to say, there were, I think, 5 women in the legislature when I was elected there. I was the only Republican, but then there were 4 or 5 women. But because there were this little band, we were able to pass in the state legislature a reform of our state rape laws to give the victim a voice, an ability to be able to stand up and not be not have different rules of evidence in rape cases, which we did. In fact, Sarah Weddington and I teamed up to do that. And because we both had the ability to bring our caucuses together, our legislative reform for rape victims became the model for the country. And now it would be unheard of to have the archaic laws that provided different evidentiary rules for rape victims versus other criminal victims. But we did the same thing in the Senate. There, we fought to make sure that mammograms stayed in healthcare coverage, which was something that was in jeopardy. We also worked together where we could. The women in the Senate never lobbied each other for votes where we were voting for a state issue that was important for our state or for a fiscal responsibility. We never got into that, but where there were issues that affected women, for instance, in the Senate, I passed the bill with Barbara Mikulski. It was the Hutchison-Mikulski spousal IRA.
And she was a liberal Democrat from Maryland.
Maryland, that's right. And when I was a single working woman, I started an IRA. And then when I married my husband, I couldn't contribute the same amount to my IRA. And I said, wait a minute, that's not right. A woman should be able, if she's working inside the home instead of outside the home, should be able to contribute to her own retirement security. And especially because so many women, either through divorce or the death of a husband, don't have a good, reliable base for their retirement. And so with Barbara Mikulski, we passed the spousal IRA that would allow a man or woman who works inside the home to be able to put in the same amount for retirement security, which if you start early, and I'm going to say to the students, if you start early with an IRA, which is only $5,000 a year or maybe $6,000 now, you can have $1 million nest egg by the end of the time that you would retire if you start early enough, because you have the compounding in a Roth IRA first and then an overall IRA that will give you a nest egg. So everyone should have one, and it's a very small amount to put aside, and if you have to sacrifice a little bit to do that, it will pay off in the end. But that's what we did. Barbara and I did that because we were women and I'd had that experience. So I brought that to the table. So again, making this maybe too long, but it is to say that a woman brings to a legislative body, especially her experience. It could be city council or school board or state or federal legislature. And it's important that all of those experiences be a part of an overall goal. Because when I did that spousal IRA, I called my friend Bill Archer as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and I said, please put the money in for this spousal IRA. And he was the great Houston congressman for years, and he said, Kate, I will do that. It's going to be on my priority list. I can't promise you how much we're going to have, but it'll be on my priority list. And then he called me one day and he said, we got it. We got it. We're going to be able to do the funding that would allow everyone to be able to set aside for a spousal IRA. And that did it. And so we got that passed. And that's why it's so important to have different backgrounds come into a legislative process.
Now, if I recall, you specialize in the Senate on defense matters, maybe not exclusively defense matters, but what was that experience like, considering that you yourself had not had military experience in prior life?
Oh, yes. Well, I did get certainly defense, because I asked to go on the Armed Services Committee when I came into the Senate, because Texas was such an important military state. We have great military bases that Texans support. We love our military and we love our military bases, and our communities adopt our military bases. It's a wonderful thing. But I got on the Armed Services Committee, and then later was on the Defense Appropriations Committee, as well as the chairman of the Military Construction Appropriations Committee. And so I had all of that I loved. I loved the whole defense area. And now I'm so involved in national security because of my service in the defense side, representing Texas, which is why I chose all of that. But then it led to my NATO ambassadorship, where it was so important that I understood NATO, had visited NATO, of course, as a senator in the national security arena. And now the national defense and our international security operations, especially with our NATO allies and our NATO partners, has become so important to our whole really priority of security for our country. And I also found at NATO that it was essential that America be the leader of international security, because the Europeans are not able to do what we do, which is assess a risk and then gear up against that risk, meaning we want to deter war. We don't want to start a war. We want to deter it through strength. As President Reagan said, peace through strength is what America provides. But others don't assess risk and then deter against it like we do. But our European allies will generally follow us. And it's important that we keep that leadership mantle. So I'm sorry to go off into that, but
No.
that's how I got into NATO. And it was just another wonderful experience that I never expected, but I certainly loved having.
Take a moment, if you will, to talk about how NATO works. It's got a diplomatic side, which you experienced personally, but then there is the military side, the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. How does that system work, and how do the two intersect?
Oh, yes, it's very interesting. The diplomatic side is very different from the Senate even. And having both, I think the U.S. ambassador to NATO is the only ambassador from the United States that reports to two secretaries, Secretary of State and Defense. It's always an appointment that it doesn't have to be approved by both, but it always is. You always would consult with the Secretary of Defense, even though the Secretary of State is the one who you're in the diplomatic corps, you're an ambassador, but you also have the close ties and the relationships with the Secretary of Defense. So it is, it's very important in NATO that the defense is always led by an American. And that's, again, an essential need, because we have a unique respect for security. I find that most of our allies value economics, and they put trade relationships into a security mix, which, while trade is important to America, of course, I mean, it's a factor, but we value security over everything from foreign policy experience. And that's important because for us, security is what has built our economy. Our people are safe, and that security breeds investment in our businesses and the economy and jobs. So that's the way we look at it. It isn't the way Europeans look at it in general. It's a general observation. And it's not, it may be how our adversaries look at it, because our adversaries are looking for taking territory and controlling their people. But in democracies, you find, and especially for smaller countries, trade seems to be their area of priority. So that's why it's so important for America to be the leader in NATO, which we are. And our European allies want us to lead. They want us to press them. They want us to lead, because they know that we're going to have the capability to assess risk. We have the best international intelligence operations. I'm trying to think of the right word. Intelligence gathering. They know that we will assess the risk, but they also know that we're going to prepare for it, because we don't want a war. And we know that if we prepare against a war, we won't have one. But if we get caught flat-footed, as the Europeans have been just this year with the Ukraine and the invasion of Russia, then it's so much more costly. And then the other reason, of course, is after World War II, President Truman and our European allies at the time knew that America coming in late in the war was so much more costly to Americans, American lives. So the Europeans wanted Americans in early, and that's why we have NATO and Article 5. And we have operated that way for the 70+ years now of NATO, because after World War I and World War II, when we lost millions of our own people, they lost millions of their own people. We wanted to deter war, and that's what NATO is. And that's why that military political alliance is the longest running military alliance in the history of the world. It's because we have the politics with it, and it is coordinated.
You mentioned Article 5. Explain that, if you will, please.
Yeah. Article 5 in NATO is that in the alliance itself, we have pledged, if one of us is attacked, we're all attacked. Article 5 means we are putting our treasure on the line, and every NATO ally must agree to that, or they would not be in NATO. And sometimes I've heard people say, does that mean if Montenegro is invaded that we're going to go to war with Russia? The answer is yes. The answer is absolutely yes, because if Russia invades a NATO ally, it won't be the last one. It would be the easiest one to pick off, and then the next one and the next one. And Europeans now realize that. It's why we now have 2 new entrants into NATO, that the processes are working, but Finland and Sweden that have tried to stay neutral for all these years realized, after what Putin has been doing, the atrocities in Ukraine, that they would be vulnerable, and they have now agreed to pledge their treasures to NATO, and we are accepting them because they will be a huge value added as we face not only Russia and a menacing Vladimir Putin, but also down the road, it's China. And we hope to deter against conflict with China, but we must be prepared in order for the president of China, so-called president of the CCP, President Xi, must know that we're ready for war, and it would be too expensive for him to go to war with us, which is what Putin knows also, because Putin has chosen to invade neighboring countries, but he's been careful to avoid NATO countries.
A final word on the NATO experience. People have a good idea, I suppose, about what it's like to be an ambassador to another country, where that's the sole focus of the U.S. ambassador. What's it like being an ambassador to an organization of many countries? Did that mean you had to move around and lobby your colleagues?
You know, it was a wonderful experience and very different from yours, because of course you did have a wonderful ambassadorship to Qatar and a very important ally, I must say right now. Qatar has become much closer to America. But having an alliance of, we had 30 ambassadors, and it was a great experience. We were very close. The other ambassadors are so professional and so steeped in history and experienced in diplomacy. And we all were friends, even when we were in disagreement about certain things. The great thing about NATO is that our ambassador corps knew that we had the same goal and that we had to get there because NATO operates by unanimous consent. So we don't have a minority report. We have to get to that point. So that means a lot of negotiation. And so we got to know each other in all those negotiations, whereas you as an ambassador representing the U.S. position in Qatar had the U.S. position for that country, whereas we had the U.S. position for the alliance. And I think the role of the United States is so important because they do expect us to lead. They know that we are the biggest defense industry in the world, and they know we have more assets, and they know we have the will to win. We have the will to assess, and we have the will to deter. And they know that we will lead. So I thought it was a great experience. I never had the experience of representing just a country, I don't say just a country, but I think it's a different relationship, but also I think it could be very rewarding to represent a country with just the U.S. position, but also getting to know your other colleagues, which of course you did, but you would have certain countries where you would have alliances with the U.S. position and then others that wouldn't. In NATO, we had everyone with the same end result orientation, but then getting there was the challenge, but it was a different kind of challenge than you would have faced.
This is very complicated, but I'm sure you can wing it in about a minute. And that is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about modern American politics and government when things are so bitter, angry, and divided?
Mm-hmm. I am pessimistic in the short term and optimistic in the long term. I think that we are at a very sad place in our history. I've never experienced such strife, although I'm sure we've had it in our history over other issues. But it's been very difficult to see the tension, the lack of civility, the lack of standards of behavior, the violence. It's been hard. The optimistic part, though, is we have a constitution, and I still thank our founding father visionaries that gave us a constitution where we protect the processes of our democracy, the separation of powers, the vote, of course, but also the rights of people. And that will prevail, I do believe, because we are the exception, and we must have an education system that teaches our young people, and I'll talk to the students now, the reverence for our country, the respect for our country, and the responsibility to keep what we started, democracy that is the voice of the people, that has to be protected. And sometimes I think our students, when I hear that there's a communist student organization on our campuses, I'm going, what are we teaching our students about the respect for our country and the responsibility to keep the freedom that we have?
Senator Ambassador Hutchison, thank you so much for your time and very valuable insights into your life and career and to our country. It's increased our desire to see you here on the University of Houston campus on Wednesday, 13th, 6 o'clock for a further conversation, at which point the audience will be invited to ask the questions. So once again, thank you so much, and thank you to all who tuned in to this edition of the Hobby Hour.
Hey, thank you, Chase. I look forward to being with you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to come spend some time at the University of Houston.
Very well. Thank you much, and goodbye.
Okay.